Hello everybody. Welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we'll be discussing the New Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 18th December 2019. Topics to be discussed are displayed on the screen and timestamping for the same are given in the description box below. So let's start our discussion. Now this topic relates to the Brahmos cruise missile in that the DRDO has successfully test-fired a land-based and an air-launched version of the Brahmos supersonic cruise missile. In this context, this news appears on page number 9 under the title Brahmos missile successfully test-fired and becomes important mainly from the perspective of prelims examination, where often questions related to the characteristics and basic principles behind different missile systems are asked. Besides, it also becomes important from the mains perspective under General Studies Paper 3 related to the security section. In this news analysis, I'll be basically discussing the basic characteristics of Brahmos cruise missile, the significance of Brahmos in the Indian security architecture, and the basic difference between cruise missiles and ballistic missiles, which is particularly important from the perspective of prelims examination. Now, as you must be aware, Brahmos is a short-range, two-stage supersonic cruise missile, which means it has speeds greater than speed of sound. Now, it is manufactured jointly by India and Russia and named after the Brahmaputra river in India and Moskva river in Russia. Besides, it is a derivative of the Russian-made P-800 Onyx, which is primarily a supersonic anti-ship cruise missile. Now coming to the characteristics of Brahmos, as I have already mentioned, it is a supersonic cruise missile which speeds up to 3 Mach, which is equivalent to 3 times the speed of sound. In addition, it weighs about 2.5 ton and can carry a conventional warhead weighing up to 300 kilos. Besides, the 9-meter long Brahmos missile has a strike range of about 300 to 400 kilometers and an altitude range of as low as 10 meters to as high as 14,000 meters. Now, the Brahmos missile has established itself as a major force multiplier in the Indian Armed Forces with its capability of being launched from multiple platforms including land, sea and air, which essentially completes the tactical cruise missile triad capability for India. Now, it should be noted that while the Army and the Navy have already inducted the missile, the air-launched version is undergoing trials and the first ever successful air launch of the Brahmos cruise missile from the Sukhoi 30 MKI multi-role aircraft was done in November 2017. Now, since this missile is capable of being launched from multiple platforms, it has established itself as the major force multiplier for Indian Armed Forces. Besides, while the anti-ship version of the Brahmos augments the Navy's first strike capabilities, the land-based Army version is designed to strike targets in the urban environments. The recent development of the air-launched platform using Su-30 MKI aircraft made Brahmos capable of keeping the carrier strike group of the enemy, particularly that of China, from the Indian mainland. This is important given the increasing Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean region, which has been a cause of concern for India. Now, besides, it should be noted that in the aftermath of the signing of MTCR regime, which is basically Missile Technology Control Regime, which removed the caps on range of cruise missiles, the range of Brahmos, which is currently around 290 kilometers, can be enhanced. Now, accordingly, India is also developing Brahmos 2 with an enhanced range of 700 kilometers with hypersonic speeds of more than 5 Mach, making it the world's fastest supersonic cruise missile. Now, besides, India has also made concerted efforts over the last few years to indigenize the various components and subsystems of the Brahmos missile. In that, recently, India equipped the ground-based or the land-based Brahmos with the indigenously developed Seeker technology. Now, India has also developed its capability in producing the navigation system that is used in these cruise missiles. Now, coming to the basic difference between cruise missile and ballistic missiles, a cruise missile, as I have mentioned, is a guided missile in that it is guided towards a preset land-based target using a navigation system. With the altitudinal range as low as 10 meters, the cruise missiles are known for low altitude flights and therefore high mobility, and hence the name cruise missile. On the other hand, a ballistic missile is generally a projectile that is shot up in the atmosphere where its warheads are detached and hit the target and usually follows a parabolic path as it uses the gravity of the earth, and hence the name. Besides, as I've already mentioned, cruise missiles have short ranges of about 300 to 1000 kilometers. In that, Brahmos has a range of 290 kilometers, which is being extended to more than 450 kilometers. The Nirbhay cruise missile also has about 700 to 1000 kilometers, and Brahmos 2 that is being developed has a range of about 700 kilometers. On the other hand, ballistic missiles are long range missiles in that they have ranges more than 1000 kilometers, that is reflected in the progressive versions of Agni, in that Agni 5 has a range of about 5000 kilometers. With relatively lesser terminal speeds, the cruise missiles are comparatively easy to intercept. Now in comparison, the ballistic missiles are difficult to intercept due to high terminal speeds of about 5000 meters per second. Besides, given the fact that the cruise missiles are guided by navigation system, they are extremely precise. Now due to the absence of such a guided system, ballistic missiles relatively are characterized with low precision. Now with relatively low speeds and low ranges, the cruise missiles are cheaper and thus suitable for carrying conventional warheads. On the other hand, ballistic missiles are extremely expensive and thus suitable for firing nuclear warheads. Now these differences between cruise missile and ballistic missile is particularly important from the perspective of mains examination, and the basic characteristics shall be important mainly from the perspective of prelims examination. Now with this, let's move to the next news. Now in a bid to give a push to the digital infrastructure development in rural areas, the government has launched the National Broadband Mission to provide for broadband access to all villages by 2022. Now in this context, this news article appears on page number 9 and becomes important from the perspective of General Studies Paper 3 under Economic Development. Now as you all must be aware, the government had launched the Digital India program in 2014 with an aim to transform India into a digitally empowered society and a knowledge economy. Now one of the key vision areas of Digital India program was infrastructure as utility to citizens. As a result, broadband highways were defined as one of the pillars of the Digital India program in order to facilitate the digital infrastructure in the rural areas. Now accordingly, the government relied on the BharatNet project, also known as the National Optical Fiber Network, which sought to trigger the broadband revolution in the rural areas in India. Now while the BharatNet project was implemented in 2.5 lakh villages, the government has now launched the National Broadband Mission to provide for a universal access of broadband network to all villages by 2022. Accordingly, the key principles of the National Broadband Mission include universality, affordability, and quality broadband network by 2022. Now, as to the need for such a broadband network, according to Acer report of 2017 named Beyond Basics, about 63.7% of the rural youth never used internet. Besides, as I have mentioned, one of the key pillars of the Digital India program is broadband highways that seeks to accelerate the broadband infrastructure across the country. Now, the key components of the National Broadband Mission includes optical fiber connectivity, which entails laying of about 30 lakh kilometer of optical fiber network, which is currently at around 22 lakh kilometers. Now, besides, the mission also seeks to increase the tower density to 1 tower per 1000 population by 2024. Now, currently, the tower density in India is about 0.42 towers per 1000 population. In addition, the mission also seeks to develop a broadband readiness index to measure the availability of digital communication infrastructure and a conducive policy ecosystem within the states. Now, as a part of this broadband readiness index, the mission also seeks to create a digital fiber map that maps the digital communication network, including optical fibers and towers across the country. Besides, the mission also seeks to address policy and regulatory changes that are required to accelerate the expansion and creation of digital infrastructure and services across the country. Now, in order to implement these components, the National Broadband Mission is provided with about 7 lakh crores, 10% of which will be funded by the Universal Service Obligation Fund. Now, as a result, the National Broadband Mission will facilitate universal and equitable access to broadband services across the country, especially in rural and remote areas. Now, as to impact of the National Broadband Mission is to fast track the growth of digital communication infrastructure. It seeks to bridge the digital divide by providing digital infrastructure to every citizen of the country, which will in turn facilitate the digital empowerment and inclusion by providing affordable and universal access of broadband to one and all. Now, this topic is particularly important from the perspective of prelims examination, especially facts related to the target year, the main components, which includes optical fibers and towers. Besides, the mission can also be mentioned as one of the points in questions related to digital infrastructure in the mains examination. Now, with this, let's move to the next news. Now, as it is well known, the Indian economy is slowing down with growth rates reaching up to 4.5% in the latest quarter, which is the lowest among the last 25 quarters. While a number of measures have been taken by the government, both on demand and supply side, the growth rates are continuing to slide. In this context, a number of policy prescriptions are being laid out by different sections of the intelligentsia, of which some are structural in nature and some are cyclical in nature. Now, in this context, the author in this article prescribes some structural reforms in order to tackle the downturn. Now, in this article, the author prescribes structural reforms that entails laissez-faire, or in other words, withdrawal of the government. Now, according to the author, this strategy of laissez-faire or withdrawal of the government opens the economy to the market forces which will take care of the supply side constraints in the economy. Now, in this news analysis, let us understand the different structural reforms that have to be adopted not only in order to tackle the slowdown in the economy, but also to be globally competitive given the changing business scenario that is driven by the digital environment. Now, it is important to understand that whenever there is a crisis in the macroeconomic indicators of an economy, it calls for a number of reforms which may be categorized under 1. Structural reforms and 2. Cyclical reforms. Now, while the structural reforms are permanent, long-term, which changes the production relations and includes factor reforms, the cyclical reforms are measures that are adopted by the government in order to balance the slowdown based on the trends. Now, therefore, the cyclical reforms are said to be more temporary in nature that target the short-term trends of slowdown or overheating of an economy. In contrast, as I've mentioned, the structural reforms are more permanent in nature, which seeks to change the production relations in the economy based on the business needs of the time and therefore more permanent and long-term in nature. Now, as a result, you may classify different measures that have been taken by the government into structural and cyclical, and under this framework, you may assess the impact of a reform that has been taken by the government. Now, therefore, the examples of structural reforms or factor reforms that seeks to change the production relations in the long term include strengthening of the financial system, change in the monetary policy framework, governance reforms, opening up of the economy through liberal FDI norms, legal reforms, etc. And the LPG reforms of 1991 is the best example of structural reforms that have been taken in the Indian economy post-independence. Now, on the other hand, the examples of cyclical reforms include the recent corporate tax rate cuts, the bank recapitalization, any stimulation package like that was given to the real estate sector in the form of setting up of an alternate investment fund, or inflation targeting by the Monetary Policy Authority or the central bank, or the compensation that has been given to the states on account of loss of GST for a temporary period, etc. entails cyclical reforms that are basically short-term in nature, targeting the immediate trends of slowdown. Now, since this article relates to the structural reforms, let us look at some of the structural reforms that India needs to adopt in order to 1. Tackle the slowdown in the growth rates, and 2. Become globally competitive in the changing business scenario of the 21st century. Now, for the purposes of simplicity, I have divided the structural reforms in India into 2 categories. One is to tackle the slowdown, and 2 that may help India to become globally competitive in the changing business scenario. Now, it is important to note that the structural reforms that are being prescribed to tackle the slowdown include factor reforms that will have a long-term impact on various sectors in the economy. Now, among the first of the factors which is responsible for production in any economy is the financial system. Now, therefore, the strengthening of financial system includes banking reforms and other fiscal reforms, including the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, the banking consolidation that led to merger of the banks, the prompt corrective action framework that is given by the RBI in order to tackle the NPAs, the revision in capital adequacy norms through implementation of the Basel III norms, the setting up of bad banks in order to tackle the NPA, etc. On the other hand, the fiscal reforms include the fiscal deficit targeting, zero-based budgeting, removal of distinction between planned and non-planned expenditure, public expenditure management, strategic disinvestment which reduces the government control in public economic enterprises, etc. As it is clear, these reforms in the financial system is an irreversible reform and is set to set the momentum for the growth of a robust financial system in the economy. Now, in addition, the tax rationalization through GST, the infrastructure reforms, opening up of the economy as was done recently by liberalizing the FDI in India, the labor market reforms that the recent labor codes have sought to bring in, promoting competition in an economy, the legal reforms including the passing of Arbitration and Conciliation Amendment Act, besides the setting up of arbitration center in Delhi to make India the hub of arbitration, and other governance reforms to tackle corruption, etc. are targeted at factor reforms under the present scenario. Now, it is important to identify a clear distinction between the structural reforms like these that are listed here, which will have a long-term impact vis-a-vis the cyclical reforms that targets the current trend in the slowdown. Now, for example, while banking consolidation, IBC, PCA, etc. is said to have an effect on NPAs in the long term, the bank recapitalization is done in order to improve the credit scenario in the economy, which is primarily a short-term measure. Now, while these factor reforms are considered to have an impact on the slowdown of the economy, there are a number of structural reforms that are necessary given the changing business scenario. Now, these include encouraging innovation, enhancing environmental sustainability given the problem of climate change and India's vulnerability to climate change, the higher education reforms that are necessary, which necessitates higher spending on R&D in India, a data protection regime in the changing business scenario driven by data, liberal FDI rules in order to expose the market forces, now antitrust regulations against the big tech companies, adoption of digital currency based on blockchain in order to tackle the corruption, and other AI-based solutions are the need of the day in order for India to be globally competitive in the changing business scenario. Now, therefore, you may use this framework in order to identify the nature of reform into one, structural and cyclical, based on whether they are long term or short term, and also categorize structural reforms into ones which are aimed at factor reforms in the present condition, and 2 that require overhaul of the production factors in an economy in order to be globally competitive. Now, this gives you an effective framework in order to structure your answers, especially in the way forward section. Besides, such definition-based questions may also be asked in prelims examination, in which the question may ask you to identify the different structural reforms and different steps which constitutes the cyclical reforms. Now, in addition, there is a mention of an index of economic freedom in this article, which ranks India at 129 out of 186 countries in its measure of economic freedom in the economy. Now, in order to cover this index, including the organization that publishes this index of economic freedom, I have framed a prelims question for practice, which we will take at the end of the discussion. Now, let's move to the next news. Now, this article relates to a surge in the aquatic invasive species in the Indian hydrological cycle as a result of climate change and frequent floods. Now, in this context, this article appears on page number 11 and becomes important from the perspective of General Studies Paper 3 under the subsection Conservation and Environmental Degradation. Now, an invasive species is said to be a threat to the biodiversity of the region, as it is not a native of that region and has a tendency to spread to a degree that is believed to cause damage to the ecology of the region and eventually the biodiversity. Now, the term that is most often used refers to the species that is usually introduced as a result of natural factors or artificial factors, but which will eventually have an adverse effect on the habitats and the bioregions that they invade. Now, this article highlights that in the recent times, as a result of floods and climate change, the aquatic invasive species have found their way in the hydrological cycle of the Indian water bodies and therefore needs an urgent attention. Now, besides, this invasive species is a serious threat to 1. The ecosystem that they invade, 2. The habitat of the native species, and 3. The entire biodiversity of the region, including the native species. Now, as I have mentioned, there is a surge in aquatic invasive species due to floods and climate change in the recent times. Now, it should be noted that there are certain exotic fishes like arapaima and alligator gar that were reported to be illegally imported to India and illegally reared as ornamental and commercial fishes. Now, these fishes that are illegally reared find their way to hydrological cycle during floods and eventually enter the water bodies, including the wetlands, rivers, lakes, etc. Now, similarly, as a result of global warming, the increase in temperature has a cascading effect on the biodiversity of a region. Now, an increase in carbon dioxide, the pH of the water, leads to a physiological stress in the native organism, as a result of which these organisms migrate to new environments. Now, as a result of this migration, the non-native species can invade and take over the ecosystem to which they migrate, thus causing a surge in these invasive species. Now, while these points may be used in the mains examination as factors for increase in invasive species across the world, the list of laws that regulate the invasive species in some form or the other becomes important from the perspective of prelims examination. In that, different laws relating to invasive species is listed here, which include the Plant Quarantine Order of 2003, the Destructive Insects and Pests Act of 1914, the Livestock Importation Act of 1898, the Environment Protection Act of 1986, and finally the Biodiversity Act of 2002. Now, as a way forward, in this article, the author highlights that due to the presence of a number of laws and as a result of which a number of agencies that are responsible for preventing the introduction of invasive species leads to complexity of laws and overlapping of functions of regulatory authorities, and therefore the author suggests for a single policy framework, and therefore the author feels the need for a unified policy framework with a single nodal agency to deal with the introduction of invasive species in India. Now, besides, the author also is of the opinion that we need a coordinated national effort to document the inventory of invasive species in India that will enable us to better monitor and regulate the most likely routes by which these invasive species are introduced in an environment. Now, besides, in order to tackle the problem of illegally reared fishes, the states should have a strong policy or a law on illegal breeding, rearing and trading of such invasive ornamental fishes. Now, in addition, while the government releases a number of details including the amount of rainfall, the water level in reservoirs, the impact of flood on essential services like transport, etc. Now it should also start collecting and publishing data on the loss on biodiversity due to these extreme weather events. Now with this, let's move to the next news. The Indo-US 2+2 ministerial dialogue is being held in India and is expected to result in further deepening of the strategic partnership between the two countries that has reached epic levels in the recent times. Now in this context, this news appears on page number 9 and becomes important from the perspective of General Studies Paper 2 under International Relations. Now while this news is a news in transition and will be covered at the end of the 2+2 dialogue, the likely issues that are to be discussed in the 2+2 include the Indo-Pacific strategy. Now it should be noted that the center of gravity of the geopolitical order has shifted from transatlantic to trans-Pacific, and given the rise of China, US views India as a strategic partner in the Indo-Pacific region. Now given the convergence of long-term interests between India and US, the two countries have upgraded their strategic partnership, bringing together the diplomacy and the strategic angle under one stage, which is the 2+2 dialogue. Now in addition to this, US views India as the net security provider in the Indian Ocean region, along with a security partner in the Indo-Pacific, which has resulted in increasing defense cooperation between the two countries. Now the other issue that is likely to be discussed is US policy in Iran and Afghanistan. Now as you must be aware, India is hesitant to accept the US diktat on sanctions on all oil imports from Iran. Besides, US talks with Taliban to determine the future of Afghanistan is a serious security threat to India in its own backyard. Now among the positives is the signing of Industrial Security Annexure, which will enable technology transfer from US defense manufacturers to Indian private sectors. In addition, one of the thorny issues between India and US relations today is the US threat of sanctions under CAATSA over S-400 deal with Russia. Now as I've already mentioned, since this news is in transition, we will cover the key highlights of the 2+2 dialogue after the results of this meeting. Now in this news analysis, let us take stock of Indo-US growing defense cooperation and the basics of Indo-US 2+2 dialogue mechanism. Now India has emerged as the key defense partner of US in the recent times, in that in 2016, India was awarded the status of a major defense partner of the United States of America. Now this allows India to receive license-free access to wide range of military and dual-use technology from US. Now as I've already mentioned, given the rise of China and the importance of Indo-Pacific as the center of gravity of geopolitical order, India is recognized as a key partner in the Indo-Pacific. Now besides, India was recently elevated to the status of the Strategic Trade Authorization 1, which means that India gets the same access as the NATO allies of US in high technology dual-use exports. Now besides, the inaugural 2+2 dialogue held in September 2018 is an indication of deepening strategic partnership in line with its converging long-time interest between India and US and importance of India as an emerging global power and a net security provider in the region. Now, growing Indo-US defense partnership is evident in the fact that the defense trade between the two countries, which was nearly zero in 2008, is currently about $15 billion. Now besides, under the foreign military sales route, the government-to-government exchanges in the recent years is valued about $1.62 billion, which includes the following defense deals. Now in addition, you must be aware that India has signed a number of foundational agreements with US that enables the strategic environment, including sharing of information, technology transfer, and extension of logistic facilities, etc. Now the four foundational agreements include LEMOA, which was signed in 2016, the GSOMIA, which was signed as early as 2002, the COMCASA that was signed in the backdrop of the inaugural 2+2 dialogue last year, besides a foundational agreement called BECA that enables sharing of geospatial and satellite data from US to India is pending, and will feature as an important issue in the ongoing 2+2 dialogue. Now, for details on foundational agreements, you may go through the DNS analysis of 24th November 2019 that was covered by Nagendra sir. Now, as to the meaning of the 2+2 dialogue, it is the institutionalization of a dialogue mechanism between two countries consisting of key ministries of Defense and External Affairs Ministry. Now, this is in recognition of importance of security issues in the overall bilateral relationship. Besides, the 2+2 dialogue between India and US is meant to replace the strategic and commercial dialogue between the foreign affairs and the commerce ministers that was held during the Obama regime. Now, as I've already mentioned, the first and the inaugural 2+2 dialogue was held in September 2018. Besides, India has a 2+2 dialogue mechanism at the ministerial level only with Japan. Now, in addition, India also has a 2+2 dialogue mechanism at the secretary level with Australia. Since this news is in transition, we will wait for the outcomes of this 2+2 dialogue and cover the relevant issues in the consequent DNS analysis. Now, this question is framed on the basis of the news that appears on page number 15 with respect to emerging market index that is published by the Morgan Stanley Capital International. Now, this index is created by MSCI in order to capture the equity market performance in the global emerging markets. Now, besides, as we can see in this graph, it is said that the index that the MSCI publishes directly correlates to the foreign capital inflows into the country. Now, this news appears in the context of the government's intention to increase the statutory limit of the foreign portfolio investors beyond 24% in the coming year. Now, as a result, India's weightage in the Morgan Stanley Capital International Emerging Market Index has risen, which will in turn result in increase in capital inflows to the country. Now, in this context, this question reads, which of the following best represent MSCI Emerging Market Index? It measures the growth rates of emerging markets, which is wrong. B, it measures the equity market performance in emerging market economies, which is correct. And therefore, B is the right answer. Now, the second question is framed on the basis of the index of economic freedom that I had mentioned while I was covering this article on page number 11 with respect to structural reforms. Now, as you would recall, the author in this article prescribed a laissez-faire or withdrawal of the government as one of the key structural reforms. Now, in this context, this question reads, which of the following publishes the Index of Economic Freedom? The answer is B, Heritage Foundation. With this, we come to the end of today's discussion. Now, let's look at the question for the day.